The 588th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
Elton ready on his second attempt. That one is no good. They battle for it. Loose ball. Recovered Marvin. He scores. 17 seconds left. And he was fouled.
Here we go. Lawson with a runner. No. The rebound. Hansbrough at the gun. Got it.
They were 4 for 24.
Hansbrough on a switch on Paulus. A deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Tipped away by Johnson. It's loose. Page. Johnson.
They're dancing in the aisles. They're high-fiving. They're celebrating. They're going bananas on Franklin Street.
Pass to Britt, 15 seconds to play. Up high to Page, gets a screen from Meeks. Page driving in on the left, high off the glass for two. Louisville with 7 seconds. Jones has it, goes left corner, Black's here for three. Back iron, 1 second to play. Stick up, no! Carolina wins it! The Tar Heels win it! 72-71. 6 seconds to go. Pinson comes front court. Pinson to May for the win. Got it! Luke May! He got it! 0.3 of a second! Luke May gives Carolina the 75-73 lead.
Are you kidding me?
Inside 30 overall. Love. Top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome into another live edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. Josh and Anthony here with you on a Sunday night, a somber Sunday night for many of us that happen to be fans of the Carolina Panthers. After another blowout loss for that team, we figured, hey, let's come on here, bring the people some joy if you're a Panther fan, talk a little Carolina basketball. We're trying to, and we're going to finish the What If series this week. Today we are in the 2000s. I think Tuesday night we'll be doing the 2010s, and that'll wrap up the offseason project that's taken forever. But we have to get it done this week because next Saturday is the blue-white scrimmage as the preseason really gets into high gear for Carolina basketball. So we're here tonight to continue our offseason project, the What If series, and I'm pretty excited about this one. This is obviously the decade that we were both introduced to Carolina basketball. It's not the one we know the most about because we didn't live everything through the 2000s as fans, but obviously a lot to break down tonight, and we're excited to do that here with you on a Sunday night. Before we get to that, though, we have to start every edition of the pod, as we always do, with the pod thought of the day. And where I grab my pod thoughts, this quote does not have an author, so it was listed as unknown, but I thought it was a great thought of the day for, where Carolina is right now, where we are as a podcast, and so on and so forth. So the thought of the day is, quote, "Don't practice until you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong." I think a big theme for Carolina in the preseason, and this is something I think you'll hear Hubert Davis talk a lot about whenever we get to hear him behind the microphone. I think really honing in on the fundamentals, the basics, doing the little things that, quite simply, this team did not do well enough a year ago. And it's a big reason why they struggled to win the games at the rate that a preseason top 10 team should have won games at. That was something that I think we talked about a lot last year, was just how Carolina was not so good at doing the basics, doing the little things. But you create those habits now. That's why the great players, the great coaches, they enjoy practice. because that's where you hone in on your craft. How you practice in practice is how you're going to play in the games. What you do in practice will carry over into the performance field, whether it's in sports, life, business, no matter what it is. Whatever you do in this arena will carry over into another one. And for a team we've talked about so much this preseason that is lacking known star power right now, they're going to have to do the little things at a really high level, so they're not opening up a door to maybe get beat by teams that they shouldn't get beat by. And so I think something that will be a theme throughout this entire preseason is they need to practice the right way. That way, doing the fundamentals becomes second nature to them once they get into the actual season, which is just over a month and a half away.
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple that when you practice, when practice is difficult, it should make the games easy. The most difficult thing that you should be doing is practicing, because, yeah, if you're doing things the right way, once you get into the regular season, you will be able to execute those much easier in games than you even do at the practice during practice. So hopefully Carolina has learned from some of the issues that they have last year. And I mean, it's the basic things. It is really, turnovers, rebounding. I mean, certain areas like that, Carolina just has to be better than they were a year ago. And I think you look at the way that this roster's built, you look at, some of the leadership that we're hoping is going to show up with this roster and some of the talent that they ended up bringing in. It might not be the most talented roster in the entire country, but you feel like it addresses some of those areas that Carolina just wasn't really that good in a year ago. So hopefully that's what we're going to see when this team takes the court, when we see them in the blue-white scrimmage. That's what we're hoping to see, is a team that's fundamentally sound. But the last time we thought that we were going to see a fundamentally sound team at Carolina, it was only a couple of weeks ago, a little over a month ago, and that didn't work out all that well. So hopefully this group has learned from that, and maybe that's an example that Hubert Davis can use, that, hey, you got to be better than that if you want to be able to come out here and have success right out of the gate to start the season.
All right, let's go ahead and get to tonight's What If series. We're in the 2000s, and when I wrote the kind of paragraph to set the scene for this decade, I wrote, quote, "The 2000s were a roller coaster of a decade for Carolina basketball, which saw three coaches roam the sidelines, the chosen one tell the Godfather no, the adopted son get fired, and more, all while the program would still go to 4 Final Fours and win 2 national championships." I think this decade really shows you the strength of Carolina basketball, because I don't know how many programs could achieve what all Carolina did with 3 coaches and some of the off-the-court drama that came along with it, with Roy Williams denying Coach Smith and denying the Carolina fan base a return home in 2000 when Bill Guthridge retired after 3 years on the sidelines. And then you go through the Matt Doherty experience, but you come out on the back end with, multiple Final Fours, multiple national championships. I don't think a Duke, a Kansas, a Kentucky could even accomplish what Carolina kind of did while going through all the different, obstacles and adversity the program endured in the 2000s decade. So the first what if will start in the year 2000, because I've often wondered this. Of course, Carolina that year, they make the Final Four as an 8 seed. It was the first time as an 8 seed they would make the Final Four. That's where we got so many comparisons during the 2022 magical run. Although 2000 did not get to Monday night, Carolina in 2022 did get to Monday night and eventually blew the biggest halftime lead in title game history. But, Carolina makes the Final Four as an 8 seed, kind of like Carolina was this past year when they made the tournament that year. They were the last team selected to make the field. They fall in the national semifinal. I've often wondered this. If that team advances to Monday night and they win the national championship, Michigan State would top Florida that year for the title. If Carolina gets to the national title game, and let's say they beat that Michigan State team, which was the last Big Ten school to win a national championship, does Bill Guthridge end up delaying his retirement? And is there a world where we never have to endure the pain that Carolina fans had to live through seeing Roy Williams, the chosen one, the one that was groomed and built to eventually take over the Carolina basketball family, tell them no in 2000? Does all that go away if that 2000 team completes the journey and wins the national championship?
No, I don't think it does, because I think that Bill Guthridge probably still ends up retiring. I mean, you got to think at that time he was still in his early 60s. I think there is a chance that maybe he would have wanted to continue coaching, but 43 years of his life had been committed to coaching. So it felt like that was probably the right time. And I think if they go out with a national championship, then he probably feels good about going out on top. He probably feels like that's the perfect way to go out, especially for him. And they probably do still transition the program. They would have felt like at that time, coming off a national championship, that it might be the best time to transition the program. I think he knew, with the fact that Carolina was struggling the way that they were after being so dominant during the 90s, the way they struggled during that 2000 regular season, I just think he knew that it was time for him to move on and for someone else to take over the program. I do wonder if, some of the energy that he had earlier on in his career had sort of been zapped by that time. And so I do believe that it still ends up being, him retiring at the end of that season. Him being, them having a coaching search that probably leads to Matt Doherty. I don't know that there's anything that's that different, but I mean, yeah, if in an ideal world, he does end up delaying his retirement, you go straight through from Bill Guthridge to Roy Williams. But you also have to wonder if Carolina wins that national championship and things don't necessarily get as bad under Matt Doherty, or if he ends up staying and things don't get that bad under Bill Guthridge, does Roy Williams ever actually come back to Chapel Hill? Because part of the reason why I believe he came back was because of how bad he saw things get there. So that's one of those things where, yeah, you say, hey, we would love to have bridged the gap, just gone straight from Guthridge to Roy Williams, because then you wouldn't have the rift with Matt Doherty. You wouldn't have had those tough seasons that you had. But at the same time, who knows if Roy Williams actually feels like he has to come back to Carolina, or he could still be, maybe not still to this point, but he could have ended up staying at Kansas and just spent his entire career there.
Yeah, I think if Carolina wins the national championship, I think Guthridge would probably just have hung on if they would have known that Roy Williams wasn't going to come. And that's kind of what the biggest wrench in all of this is that, and you can call it arrogance, maybe on the Carolina side of things. It never really entered their mind that he would say no. Like, as much as I've read about this situation, I've read about it from, in Roy Williams's book. I've read about it through numerous Archansky books where he details the situation. It was just kind of just an accepted thought and reality that, he would take the job and that he would come back. With the way that Dean Smith retired, that kind of, there was no option for Roy Williams to leave, that he would not leave Kansas on the brink of fall practice for Carolina. And he always wanted to have Bill Guthridge, because he was so loyal as an assistant, a chance to run the program. But he always thought that whenever Bill Guthridge was done, that Roy Williams would just come on home because it's Carolina. It's where he went to school. And I believe it with all my heart that when Dean Smith hired him as a part-time assistant, the grooming process for him to become the next head coach began then, just like when Hubert Davis joined Carolina staff when he left television just a little bit over a decade ago. I thought from the moment Roy Williams hired Hubert Davis, he hired him to groom him to be the next caretaker of the Carolina basketball program, and that's where we find ourselves right now. Although, of course, Hubert does have to kind of have a pretty big year this year to make sure he's on the sidelines moving forward. I've got a personal what if for you and I, because obviously if you know us, if you followed us for a long time, you know that we are Roy Williams guys. That was the coach that we grew up with. The first iteration of the podcast was named after him, where now it's just a generic The Four Corners podcast set away. Until I quit podcasting, it can always cover Carolina basketball and not be tied to a coach. There were a lot of Carolina fans that even when he did come back, and even when he won the 3 national championships and did the things that he did, still never forgave him for saying no in 2000. I was raised by a man.
Idiots. So.
I was raised by a man that, for as much as he loved Carolina basketball, was kind of hard for him to accept that Roy Williams told Dean Smith no when the job came available upon Bill Guthridge's retirement back in 2000. My what if for you and I is, let's say we were fans then like we are now, and we got to experience that coaching search like we got to experience it when he retired and Carolina hired Hubert Davis. Do you think you would feel differently about Roy Williams had you had to kind of follow and see him publicly turn down the Carolina job to stay in Lawrence?
I mean, maybe a little bit differently, but I mean, if you're one of those fans that still can't forgive him for that, and you don't take into account all of what he did at Carolina and how much success he had and led Carolina to, then I just really don't know what to tell you. I mean, I would never be like that. I mean, especially once he eventually came back, it'd be similar to what happened with Mack Brown. Mack Brown, a lot of people were very angry when Mack Brown left the program back in 1997, but ultimately when he ends up coming back, he was forgiven because he came back to the program, was able to turn them back into a competitor, at times. Unfortunately, it wasn't consistent and would drop off throughout the year. You'd go from being a competitor early in the season to not being a competitor when it mattered the most. I don't think, with Roy Williams, it would have been even completely different than that because, Roy ends up coming back and within 2 years leads Carolina to a national championship. So, I mean, yeah, he certainly, I think, needs to be given the grace of that by some of these fans that still can't forgive him for turning down the job. I mean, look, we all make mistakes, and I don't even know if that was a mistake at the time for Roy Williams. I think he was, again, still trying to establish his own identity, that he wasn't just Dean Smith's assistant, Roy Williams. He wanted to be known as Kansas's head coach, Roy Williams, as one of the most successful coaches in all of college basketball at the time. And so I think the timing of when he came back worked out perfectly because, who knows if Carolina ends up winning a national championship in 2005, if he comes back earlier, maybe they do end up winning a championship even earlier than that, but who really knows? I would not change the course of how things happened because of the amount of success that Roy Williams had when he came back. So I would like to believe that it wouldn't change that much. But, I do think that there would be part of us that would probably still remember the fact that he did say no to Carolina, but ultimately that would be overshadowed by the fact that he had so much success when he said yes to Carolina in 2003.
Yeah, look, you'd be hard pressed to find someone that loves, respects, admires, worships Roy Williams more than I do. He's the most influential male in my life outside of my father. I hung on to every word that he said and delivered as Carolina's head coach, and really still to this day. That's just the kind of presence that and the kind of impact he's had on me. But knowing me and knowing how I feel about the program and the family, there would have been some short-term vitriol had I gone through and saw him say no. Now, it would have been forgiven. It would have been like, the family member that, ruins a holiday or two, but eventually gets back into good graces. I have a couple of that guy, right? Of my own that have ruined some of my holidays that I have since forgiven. I think that's kind of what it would feel like, where you'd never forget it, but you would then just be so thankful and appreciative for what he did, the championships, the Final Fours, the memories on and off the court, winning with the same grace and dignity that Dean Smith did, that you would have, like, I feel like I would have got to the point where, like, I'd have been, like, okay with it. Like, but still would probably always have a little small part of my heart that hurt. But, when you still get to experience the things you get to experience. And I think you got to remember, he stayed at Kansas out of loyalty and commitment to recruits that he told when he recruited them, I'll be here for your entire year. Like, that's what never made sense to me, is Carolina fans got so mad at him for showing the same loyalty to his players at Kansas that Dean Smith showed at Carolina. Like, and so it wasn't like he stayed because of money. It wasn't like he stayed for benefits. It wasn't anything like that. It was out of a promise that he made to 3 recruits, Nick Collison, Kirk Heinrich, and Drew Gooden, that he would be in Lawrence for their entire college basketball careers. And back then you stayed 3-4 years. You weren't one and dones, which really complicated the process as well. Had he done that in this day and age, it wouldn't have been an issue, because as good as those guys were in college, they wouldn't have stayed for 4 years. They would have been gone. And so I think it's kind of important to remember that he stayed out of loyalty and out of a promise he made to his players, not for anything that Kansas was willing to offer him that North Carolina wasn't. But ultimately, it all worked out into the end. Let's move on to the next what if. Let's get into 2001, which was Matt Doherty's first year in Chapel Hill, and it was his best year as Carolina's head coach. Carolina would reach number 1 in the AP poll. They were a number 2 seed in the NCAA tournament and went on, I believe, it was an 18-game winning streak during his first season on the sidelines in Carolina. But this is where the Crispin brothers show up. They upset Carolina. Penn State did in the second round of the NCAA tournament. And so I kind of parlay this into maybe where we are right now with Hubert Davis, as he's entering a pivotal year as Carolina's head coach. Let's say that team makes the second weekend of the tournament. Heaven forbid they make a Final Four. Kind of like what Hubert did in his first year, although he did it as an 8 seed, not as a team that was one of the best teams in the country throughout the duration of the season. But if Carolina had more success in March in Matt Doherty's first year, do you think that he would have been given more leeway in terms of kind of getting to deal with the ups and downs? Next year you go 8-20. The following year you go 19-16 and you get fired. If Carolina plays deeper into March, do you think there's a scenario where he's not fired after 3 years?
Yeah, I think that certainly is the case. I think there is a chance that Carolina ends up holding on to him, because you would have seen that it has been successful at some time under him. I mean, that first year, now again, you can do the same thing with Roy Williams and with Hubert Davis taking over, say that it was his players, which a lot of people would say, hey, those were Bill Guthridge's players. So any success that he had with them doesn't really matter. The thing is that I still think you got to give the coach of those teams credit, because you're leading a group that you weren't necessarily higher, or when you, especially with Matt Doherty, when you were brought in having not had any connections to these guys. Hubert Davis, it was a little bit different. You were on the staff recruiting some of the guys to the roster, and you were coaching some of those guys on the roster. But I mean, yeah, for Matt Doherty, he had no ties. He was coming over from Notre Dame. So, I mean, you look at it, I mean, that team, especially if they had made some sort of run, their best players were Joseph Forte and Brendan Haywood, who are, good players, guys that most Carolina fans remember, but also not program legends. It wasn't those types of guys that were on the roster. So I do think that you probably end up giving him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. And you say, hey, even when they go 8-20, it was just a really bad season. This core just really didn't fit together. The 19-16 season then probably looks like, hey, this is back-to-back years where we've kind of struggled. Maybe at that point it puts him on the hot seat. So maybe it buys him another year. Ultimately, I think he probably ends up getting fired anyways, because things were just way too it just turned into complete turmoil at a time. I mean, again, he was, arguing with Dean Smith. There was stuff that, behind the scenes wasn't really that great. And eventually, even if, it wasn't that they fired him, he might have just moved on himself because there was so much frustration going on between Carolina's current head coach and Carolina's former head coach. So you never know what it could have bought him. I mean, especially a Final Four appearance, maybe that does end up buying him 2-3 more years. But I do think that, there would have been at least a little bit more time bought for him if they don't lose to the Crispin brothers over there at Penn State, which is why, for us, for guys that are big Roy Williams guys, that's why we respect John Crispin so much, is because that moment actually, in a way, led to Carolina, eventually landing Roy Williams as their head coach.
I think if they play deeper into March, he maybe would have gotten a much bigger leash from the fan base, from the administration and the people that were the decision makers. It would not have mattered. Just because of how fractured relationships were, I don't think it would have made that much of a difference. You're talking about a guy that was, beefing with the godfather of the program, beefing with current players on his staff. And this was, not popular at the time. But if he wouldn't have been fired, the core group that helped Carolina win the national championship in 2005 was all going to transfer, or just go ahead and go pro. That's how unenjoyable their Carolina experience was their freshman and sophomore years under his watch. And so I think from the outside, for what fans would have said, I think the fans would have been a lot more open to, hey, give him one more year because you just don't go to the Sweet 16, Elite 8, the Final Four by accident. But the people behind the scenes, the power brokers that be, I do not think it would have made that big of a difference. I do think the next what if, though, could have played a bigger role in potentially him not being fired. And this is something that even Roy Williams wrote about, like in his book. If you ever read his book, Hard Work, he kind of takes you through his feelings this last year at Kansas, which, that team lost the national championship game to Syracuse, but also he was monitoring what was going on at Carolina, because once Sean May broke his foot, he knew that the job was going to become open. And you're talking about a team that actually beat Kansas in the preseason NIT, had the look and the feel of a team that would at least make the tournament, maybe win a game and be done, but definitely had the look and the feel of a team that would kind of get Carolina basketball back on track, which, of course, they won under Roy Williams with Raymond Felton, with Sean May, Rashad McCants, Jawad Williams, and those guys. But Sean May breaks his foot, and Carolina's season goes up in smoke, and they finish the season 19-16, back-to-back years. They don't make the NCAA tournament. That's a combined 36 losses in 2 years. I mean, we complain now about having 20 losses in 2 years. Carolina lost 36 games in 2 years under Matt Doherty, his last 2 years on the job in Chapel Hill. Do you think if Sean May stays healthy, and with what that team did early on in the season, do you think they would have won enough to maybe delay Doherty's eventual firing?
Yeah, probably. I mean, the fact that they won 19 games without Sean May being a part of that, I mean, he only played in 11 games before he ends up getting injured. So the fact that they were able to get to 19 wins, that probably means that Carolina would have been somewhere in the mid-20s, probably in terms of the amount of wins, because Sean May really was that good of a player. Now, you look at what he had produced before he gets injured, and he wasn't scoring it the way that he does eventually in 2005. But, I mean, he's certainly, at 11.4 points per game, 8.1 rebounds per game. He was a growing force on the interior for Carolina. I think he would have done enough to help elevate this team and probably keep Matt Doherty's job potentially for another year or so. I think it would have been very similar to what we're seeing here with Hubert Davis right now. Again, you'd be in that range. You'd still be a team that maybe would be on the tournament bubble. There would be questions about why are we here as a program. But you would say, hey, we do have Rashad McCants, we do have Raymond Felton, and we do have Sean May from that great recruiting class that has Carolina in position to be able to compete this upcoming season. We're going to probably keep Matt Doherty around because he brought those guys in here. And the thing is, you would expect that by the end of the season, Sean May would have been playing even better. So you would say, hey, we got the development of all three of these guys. Let's hold on to them and see what they can be next year, because if we end up letting them walk, who knows where these guys end up going. The thing is that you do wonder, though, you mentioned it, the fractured relationships, not only with Dean Smith, but then with guys on his own roster. You really wonder, those guys were probably going to leave. If they had said, look, even though we had a pretty successful year, we won 25 games or whatever they would have ended up winning with Sean May, you would believe that a lot of those guys would have still went into administration and told them, look, it's either we stay or he stays. It's you guys have to make a decision. So I do think that, in terms of the on the court stuff, would it have been able to buy Matt Doherty another year or so? Probably. But I do wonder if because of how fractured some of those relationships still were, if they would have just said, even with the success that he had and looking like that 8-20 season was just a blip on the radar, I do wonder if they just say, forget it, we're moving on because we want to make sure that we're holding on to May, Felton, McCants, and that core group.
Yeah, I think what really made it easier for them to make this move and what pushed them over the top was Kansas losing the national championship game and the people behind the scenes knowing that Roy Williams was no longer happy with his off-the-court stuff at Kansas because his relationship with the AD had gone south. And I think that I think those two things really, really opened the door for Roy Williams to come back. Because I don't believe if Kansas wins the national championship in 2003, I don't think Roy Williams leaves. I find it hard to see him leaving a program that he would have finally climbed the mountaintop, would have finally won a national championship. And you mentioned back in the year 2000 about he was maybe still trying to establish himself as a head coach. By 2000, he was established. He was, in 2000, the best coach in the sport, maybe right up there with Jim Boeheim, to not have a national championship to his resume. He was so good in 2000. He'd already been courted by the Lakers and the Celtics to leave college and go coach in the NBA. Once it had kind of got known in the basketball community with some of his recruiting struggles, he was not happy in Kansas in the late 90s. Of course, all that changed, and he stayed there for a few more years. But I think if Sean May doesn't break his foot, I think the decision gets tougher. But I think they knew I believe they kind of were waiting with bated breath, wanting to see what happened in that national title game to really ultimately make their decision. And the fact that they got beat and he wasn't happy off the court made it easier to move on from Matt Doherty because they felt like they had a better chance to convince Roy Williams to come home, which, of course, he obviously did. I think that's a different – that's something that if I could ever get Roy Williams one-on-one in an honest setting to answer that question, I would be interested to know what his answer would be. And I think if he's being honest with himself and he'd be honest with us, I think he would tell you, if I would have won the national championship in 2003, I wouldn't have left. Now, he did talk about in his book where, the ailing, his ailing father and his sister made it much more of a drive to come back home to be around them a little bit more as they were kind of in their final days. And I don't think he is lying about that. But with the kind of money that he had and the kind of resources that they would have made available to him, had he wanted to stay at Kansas and get flown back and forth to visit his family, Kansas would have made sure that would have been made possible to ensure he stayed on the sidelines, considering that if he doesn't leave, you got to realize that Allen Fieldhouse would be named Allen Williams Fieldhouse. Like, he was that close to getting his name on the floor in Kansas, which just really shows you how freaking great of a coach this guy is. Where his name's on the floor in Chapel Hill, and if he doesn't leave in Lawrence, his name would have been on the floor at that building too. Two of the most hallowed venues in all of college basketball. So, but the May injury, I think, definitely accelerated the timeline. You can't lose 36 games in 2 years at Carolina. But I still think ultimately, even if there wouldn't have been a clear candidate outside of Roy Williams, I think Carolina would have moved on just because the relationships off the court were too fractured to really employ Matt moving forward. Let's move on to 2005. A few more what-ifs from the 2000 decades before we do get out of here. The 2005 year, of course, Carolina wins the national championship. They return all those guys that you were in jeopardy of losing had Matt Doherty stayed. Felton back, May back, McCants back, Jawad Williams back. Preseason number 1. They lose their first game of the year at Santa Clara. I can vividly remember listening to my dad react to them losing that game, because why in the heck is North Carolina losing at Santa Clara with all that talent? But that's something that happened. But the big piece to that team that year was obviously the addition of 5-star freshman Marvin Williams, who you saw in the new open for season 5 of the podcast, scored maybe the loudest bucket in Smith Center history, the putback against Duke in 2005, where Carolina completed a 9-point comeback in 2 minutes. So the what if for 2005 is, what if Marvin Williams had gone somewhere else? I was reading up on his recruitment. He's from the state of Washington, so he chose Carolina over Washington, and believe it or not, Kansas was also highly involved in his recruitment as well. If Marvin Williams, who's always been credited as the missing piece, the kind of the last piece of the puzzle for that 2005 squad, if he doesn't end up in Chapel Hill, do you think Carolina conquers the college basketball world as quickly as they did under Roy Williams, winning the tournament in just his second season?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, you look at how impactful he was for this team. I mean, 11.3 points per game, 6.6 rebounds per game, was an effective, effective enough three-point shooter when they needed him to be. He didn't take a ton of shots, not like he did eventually when he gets to the NBA, where he became more of an outside threat there. But, I mean, still, was relatively decent from out there for Carolina. Shot 43% from outside. If he doesn't end up coming, what ends up happening is that you then probably need to use more of David Noel, more Rayshon Terry, and these are guys that just weren't great scorers of the basketball, not the way that Marvin Williams was. They weren't able to rebound at the rate that Marvin Williams was. And so I wonder, with those guys having to move into expanded roles, do they actually end up being able to make up for what would have been left behind by him, especially against a team as great as Illinois was. So I think, Carolina, could they have gotten to the Final Four with the group that they had? Yeah, I could definitely see that. Could they have even gotten to the national final against Illinois? I think that would have been possible. But, I mean, you look at what Marvin Williams did even in that game, 8 points off the bench, but 5 total rebounds in the game. And what he was as a defender, I think, was definitely something that has to be taken into account as well. I think without Marvin Williams, there's a good chance that Carolina probably doesn't end up winning that national championship over a very loaded Illinois squad.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that as well, just because you look at like every major point in the season, it felt like Marvin Williams was involved in that game, in that moment, doing something that contributed to Carolina winning. And you're talking about, a top flight recruit, the potential, the future number 2 draft pick in the NBA draft, and a guy that, did enjoy a long career in the NBA. Yeah, if you take that away from that Carolina team, it is kind of, I think, harder to envision them still cutting down the nets. Do they win an ACC title? Do they make a Final Four? Probably. And for Carolina fans, after the losing all those games they did with Matt Doherty, we would have just been as elated to make the Final Four as they were probably when they won the national championship. But I do think if you take him off that roster and they play Illinois in that final, then yeah, maybe that Illinois team, which is an all-time team, by the way, to not win a national championship, maybe that pushes that group over the top, and they're the ones cutting down the nets instead of Carolina. So, it's why I think Marvin is held in such reverence as a one and done, because I believe to this day he's still the only one and done to win a national championship. But it's also like everyone talks about the importance he had. Well, I guess Tony Bradley was a one and done, but he didn't have the same role that Marvin had. No. But if you hear Ray, if you hear Sean, when we used to care what Rashad McCants said before he went crazy, they all talked about the role that Marvin Williams had for them winning a national championship. And same thing with Roy Williams. If all those guys are going to speak in such high regard of him, then I think I'm willing to admit that if that guy wasn't on the roster, then maybe, just maybe, they don't go on to win the national championship. Let's now get
the one thing I will say just real quick. I mean, you look at the next year, Rayshon Terry, becomes a really good scorer of the basketball for Carolina, shoots 38% from beyond the arc. David Noel shoots 42%. But you do kind of wonder, would they have been ready for that moment that season where they're not necessarily in starting roles, where they became starters in 2005, 2006. So, maybe it is closer than we really think. Maybe those guys would have been able to step up, and Carolina does find a way to win a national championship. But I just wonder, with his impact on the defensive end of the floor, would that really have been the biggest difference with not having him and having to use Rayshon Terry and David Noel in his place instead?
I'd really like to think so, because now technically, yes, Rayshon Terry was on that Final Four team, was on that national title team, but he did not get to enjoy what I wanted him to enjoy in 2007 when Carolina lost in the Elite Eight to Georgetown. He's one of the he's on that list of guys that, for me as a fan, that I really hate didn't get to the pinnacle of the college basketball world. Your average Carolina fan maybe could not tell you who Rayshon Terry is. Rayshon Terry was a part of the first team that I fell in love with, and when I really knew this was not just me becoming a fan of this program, this would become what is now a lifelong love affair. He was on that team. And so, when Carolina lost in 2007, as upset as I was for Ty Lawson, my favorite player, or Wayne Ellington, or Tyler Hansbrough, I was heartbroken because Rayshon Terry wasn't getting to go to a Final Four and not get to have that kind of moment that I thought he was worthy of having. So speaking of that, let's move on to 2006. What really allowed Carolina to reestablish itself as the premier program in the sport was the arrival of Tyler Hansbrough, the program's all-time leading scorer, the league's all-time leading scorer, 4-time All-ACC, 4-time All-American. For my monies, he's the best player to ever play basketball in the ACC at the college level, not projecting what he would do at the NBA level. He committed to Carolina and Roy Williams, while Roy Williams was coaching the Olympic team over in Athens in 2004, and he chose so over Missouri, where his dad and I believe his mom were both graduates of. If we were to think about this and allow our minds to not have all the great moments that Tyler Hansbrough delivered during his illustrious career in Chapel Hill, do you think that if Hansbrough goes to Missouri, that Carolina establishes itself as the best program in the sport as quickly as it did under Roy Williams? Because from 2005 through 2009, you went to 3 Final Fours, you won 2 national championships, you were never worse than a 3 seed in the NCAA tournament, ACC regular season titles, ACC tournament titles. Hansbrough was the extension of that first championship into the next 4 years. Is all that possible with just maybe Ty Lawson, Wayne Ellington, Danny Green, and Deion Thompson and those guys?
I mean, you're talking about the most dominant player that we watched in ACC history And we have made the argument that he is the greatest player in ACC history. I mean, you're talking about a guy that was a first-team All-American all 4 years that he was at Carolina. I mean, he is that good of a player to where if Carolina doesn't have him, I don't know that they end up getting to the level of success that they did. The one thing that you would have been hoping for and just crossing your fingers and praying ended up happening is that Brandon Wright, when he comes in 2006, 2007, realizes that, hey, there's nobody else on this team. There's not this super talented big man beside me that is standing in my way. I'm going to stay here for 3-4 years of my own and build my own legacy at this level instead of going to the NBA. If he chooses to go to the NBA, then I don't really think Carolina ends up winning a national title during that time. Now, the argument would be made, and this is probably true, what would end up happening is that they would go out and get somebody else. They wouldn't have just said, okay, we don't have Tyler Hansbrough, we're building the rest of our roster without him, and we just have to figure out how to play without a guy at the center position that was as dominant as Hansbrough was. They would have eventually went out and found somebody. I don't know who that would have been. Maybe it could have been somebody like, a Greg Oden during those times or something like that, where maybe they find that guy that ends up actually helping them get over the hump. But it's far from a guarantee. I mean, Hansbrough was the sport's most dominant player, especially in 2007, 2008, and then of course into 2008, 2009. I think those are memories that for Carolina fans are incredibly special. And that's what makes this question probably the most difficult outside of, what happens if Roy Williams never comes back to Carolina, because he was just such an iconic piece of what they do. And it's so hard to imagine with him gone from that group, unless Ty Lawson really was just able to take it to a whole nother level. Wayne Ellington, is able to up his scoring even a little bit more than he was scoring it during that 2008-2009 season. I mean, I just can't see any way that they end up winning the national championship unless Deion Thompson is all of a sudden just a force that to be reckoned with that we didn't know that he could be because Tyler Hansbrough was there. We got a peek of that the year afterwards. Now, granted, there weren't a lot of guys around him on that team, but you saw that he wasn't able to necessarily dominate the way that Tyler Hansbrough was able to dominate. So I find it hard to believe that Carolina wins the national championship without Tyler Hansbrough, who you could, to this day still argue is the program's greatest player.
It's not even just the fact that they won a national title. You're talking about 3 Elite Eights and 2 Final Fours in a 4-year time span that he helped bring to the program. His first year, they get upset in the second round by that George Mason squad. But once he hit the 3 to end, J.J. Redick's career at Duke, I mean, that season was made. Everything they did after that was pretty much going to be gravy. And so I think it would just be arrogant on our end to think that Carolina could, if we're living in this world where this stuff doesn't happen, that Carolina achieves all that without him. And also it would kind of take away from his greatness and the legacy that he's left behind. If we say, Brandon Wright, Alex Stevenson, one of those guys come in here and have the same level of impact. Like, it was Tyler Hansbrough my favorite player to watch as a Carolina fan? He was not. I've owned that. I was, as a young guard that played guard when I played basketball, I was infatuated with Ty Lawson. He was the first ever player that I fell in love with. But, I mean, I did enjoy and appreciate and understand how good, how dominant Tyler Hansbrough was. And, like, when Carolina got to the Final Four in 2009, I wanted him to have a national championship. Like, it's the same way that I felt about with Marcus Page and Bryce Johnson in 2016. Like, as much as I wanted the team, the program, Roy Williams, and the fan base to win a national title, I wanted Tyler Hansbrough to win a national championship because he had achieved everything else except cut down the nets. And I thought a guy that, at that time stood for everything that was right about college athletics, I thought deserved to have his one shining moment. And he was able to have that. I also think it's kind of interesting, if 2007, this is the first, I talk about this a lot, where we all remember when we fell in love with a team and how you knew your fandom was more generic than, well, I'm just going to watch them play. I'm going to let them dictate my life and my mood, which Carolina basketball still does to this day. That 2007 loss to Georgetown broke a young Josh watching them blow an 11-point lead in 2.5 minutes to Georgetown, Roy Hibbert, and they go on to the Final Four. I mean, we're talking about he was a collapse away from playing in 3 Final Fours. Mm-hmm. If he adds a 3rd Final Four to his resume in the modern era of the tournament, I wonder what that would do to his legacy. Because we see what has happened for Christian Laettner, someone that got to go back-to-back at Duke. And, kind of what maybe when we get farther removed from when UConn went back-to-back, or what back-to-back meant for Joakim Noah, Al Horford, and those Florida teams. But, if he adds a 3rd Final Four to his resume, whether they win the national championship or not, I think that vaults him up the ladder of all-time college basketball players as well. And you're maybe then having a serious conversation about, is he a top 5 college basketball player, of all time? Because when we go through these lists, he's on the list, but he's nowhere nearly highly as ranked as we believe he should be. But if 2007, if that group breaks through and he gets to 3 Final Fours in the modern era, I mean, what other player of his stature would able to say that he got to play in 3 Final Fours? Ben Howland took UCLA to 3 straight Final Fours, but what player on those rosters were the best player, a 4-time All-American, a 4-time All-ACC, all-time leading scorer for the team in the conference? That's another thing about his career, is that he was denied a Final Four, that if he has another one, we're really talking about him being, in the modern era of the sports from 1985 on, the most accomplished player bar none.
Yeah, I think that would certainly have gotten him into that category. I think he's, still there right now. I think you could still have that conversation. But to me, that would, put even more emphasis on the conversation of him being the greatest player in the history of the ACC. People now still argue that David Thompson was better than him. Christian Laettner, what he was able to do was more impressive than what Tyler Hansbrough was able to do. But, I mean, from our perspective, you mentioned it, 4-time All-American, wasn't a first-team All-American his first year on campus. He was second-team All-American, but still, I mean, that accomplishment, along with just how dominant he was as a scorer, as a rebounder, those scoring numbers still the all-time leader in scoring in ACC history. To add a 3rd Final Four to that, and who knows, potentially add another championship to that. I mean, God forbid he was able to find a way to go back-to-back at some point, because I don't know if they end up winning the national championship in 06, 07. I don't know if he goes to the NBA that early. I think he probably ends up still sticking around. We've had the debates as to whether or not, if Carolina wins the national championship in 2008, do most of those guys end up going? But I think 2006, 2007 definitely would have been a little bit too early. So he probably ends up sticking it out, and God forbid they go back to back. To me, then there's absolutely no conversation that he's the greatest player in the history of the ACC, and it's not even close. So, I mean, for me, growing up, he was my favorite player. He's the guy that to this day is still my favorite player that I've ever watched at Carolina. He was just that dominant. He was, as goofy as it came with some of the faces that he gave you, but you could not stop the man. And I love big man play. There's no doubt about that. But I think I don't even know how to describe what it was like just to watch him have that type of success on the floor, and why I was so, why it was something that was so special for me to watch. he was just one of those athletes that I latched onto, man. David Wright was just like that. Eli Manning was very similar to that. But he was right there with those guys, if not even ahead of those guys at a time. And to be honest with you, if he wasn't the guy that was my favorite player growing up, I don't know who would have been my favorite player. That really would have been an interesting conversation. It probably would have been Ty Lawson, especially because I believe he would have had to take his game to another level because you wouldn't have had that dominant big man here. But you never really know. Maybe it ends up becoming Brandon Wright if he ends up staying for Carolina and becomes a dominant big man himself. But that certainly is something I do not want to have to think about because I love the fact that I get to remember those times with Tyler Hansbrough as the big man in the middle for Carolina and just how much success and excitement he brought to Chapel Hill.
Yeah, I mean, he was as unique a player to watch because his game wasn't pretty, but it was dominant.
Yep.
And it was, we kind of have this thing, or I have this thing where, like, when I'm watching my teams play and they do something, I just laugh. That started with him because he would do things that you could not react to other than laugh because it didn't make any sense how he made that shot, how he got that rebound, how he dunked over a guy that was 7'1" or 7'11", whatever the guy from UNC Asheville is. Like, he just did so many things that you couldn't really describe. You just had to kind of laugh at it, and that was your way of appreciating it. I don't think, if they break through 2007, I don't think they win the national championship. That Florida team, I don't think gets enough credit and respect for just how dominant they were, mainly because I believe their second championship squad was nowhere near as good as their first. I may have it backwards, but I think it was their second one that might have been the lesser of the two. But, if you're going to 3 Final Fours in the modern tournament era, I mean, and if you believe what I believe, where making the Final Four, winning the national championship is the hardest thing to do in American sports, then it just really elevates your legacy to something that really just you can't quantify, you can't touch. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and it wasn't the first heartbreak that we got to endure. Because we had 2008, and 2008 for us, that was, if people want to peek behind the curtain, that was the first year that obviously we met. That was where the friendship, the bond that is now carried over so many years later began. And it really, if we're being honest, our friendship cultivated around a love of sports and interest in sports. I always joke about I got you into college athletics because you being growing up in a New York household was not really introduced to that. But introduced you to how big of a Carolina fan I was, and we latched on. And I can still remember the phone call we had after that loss to Kansas in 2008. Just the agony and the pain that it felt trying to talk through a game where Carolina once trailed 40-12, was then down by 2 with a chance to take the lead. A Danny Green 3-pointer rattles out, and Carolina would go on to eventually get blown out again and lose to Kansas in the national semifinal. And this is where we get to if they win the national championship in 2008, which I do think from a pure talent perspective and everything that team consisted of, better than 2009. Like 2008 is to Roy Williams what 1984 was to Dean Smith. That was maybe his best team. And it ultimately did not win. It did not cut down the nets and win a national championship. But if they do win the title in 08, do you think there's a scenario where Carolina could have joined Duke, could have joined Florida as teams to run it back and win back-to-back national championships?
I don't see it. I really think because you look at where these guys end up going in the NBA draft in 2009. Tyler Hansbrough goes 13th overall to the Pacers. Ty Lawson goes 18th overall to Minnesota. Eventually, of course, that ends up getting traded to Denver. And then Wayne Ellington goes 28th to the Minnesota Timberwolves. You'd imagine that they would have been in a similar area maybe some of these guys end up going earlier. Some of them end up going just a little bit later based off of what was in the previous draft during that time. You'd imagine these guys still end up getting drafted pretty high, and they would have entered after 2008 because the goal would have been met at that point. And you're right. That team was better than 2009. Mainly because I think the reason that you give them the edge is because you had a healthy Marcus Ginyard. You did not have that when you end up making the run in 2009. He ends up getting injured preseason, I believe, or if it wasn't, it was very early in the season. And that just, at that point, Carolina, I think still the belief was that they were going to win a national championship because they were just so successful. You had Danny Green who could slide into the starting lineup for him, and it fit like a glove, and Carolina was still able to be incredibly successful and, of course, win the national championship. But, that team in 2008 was absolutely loaded. It was probably the best 6 players that anybody had in the entire country. That 6-man award, that you have at some levels of college or of basketball, that certainly would have gone to Danny Green with how successful he was coming off the bench for Carolina, what he meant from, just a culture standpoint for that group. But yeah, I find it hard to believe those guys say, hey, we're running it back. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe most of those guys end up saying, hey, we're still too young. We still feel like there's more that we can accomplish here. We feel like we can go back to back, just like Florida did right before Carolina would have had the opportunity to do it if they win in 2008. But I just think, especially for a guy like Hansbrough, you wonder at that point, where he was. That was his best season. He was, AP Player of the Year, Wooden Award winner, and a first-team All-American because he averaged 22.6 points per game, which led the country, and 10.2 rebounds per game, which led the country. You do wonder, does he go earlier in the lottery because of that season? If that was the year that they judged him off of, he probably ends up going top 10 in the NBA draft. And so without him, even if you do get Lawson, you get Ellington, they run it back, I do think they would have been a pretty good team, with Deion Thompson as the focal point down low, along with Ty Lawson and Wayne Ellington. But I just don't know that they would have been able to win a national championship without Hansbrough. Again, that goes to us being a little, too arrogant, probably, if in that case. Even if Carolina is able to recruit a pretty good big man, is he going to be able to just slide in there and give you what Hansbrough was able to give you? Probably not. That would take away from the greatness of Hansbrough. So I think because of that, that's probably the reason why I would say they do not end up going back to back. But Lord knows if that was actually the case and it was meant to be that all those guys would have came back, boy, would I have loved for that to happen. But we all know who we blame to this day that took away that game from us in the Final Four against Kansas. It wasn't Kansas. It was the officials who we hate to this day.
Yeah. If Carolina wins the title in 2008, I think Tyler Hansbrough comes back because I think he genuinely enjoyed college. Not to get into his personal business, he was never at a need for money. Like he grew up in a pretty wealthy establishment. So, I think he comes back because why not? Your other guys, Ellington, Lawson, Danny Green, don't come back. And I can say that because they literally waited until the final day after the 2008 loss to Kansas in the Final Four to withdraw their name from the NBA draft, which back then was June 15th, or it might have been June 16th. It was one of those 2 days because my stepmom's birthday is the 15th and my sister's birthday is the 16th. And I could remember telling them that their birthday was not as important as what those guys ended up doing with their basketball decisions. That did not go over very well in the Marlowe household, but the fact still remains that their futures about whether to play at UNC or to go pro are more important than them turning a year older. Obviously, all those guys come back and they go on to win the national championship. And, we've done some what ifs that were kind of negative. I don't know about you. I'm not even comfortable wanting to talk about what if they don't get the job done in 2009.
No, we're just
because I mean, has there been a less enjoyable championship? I know for me as a fan, like there was so much that I didn't enjoy about that title because like I went into the year and and I can remember it's my third year watching the sport. Not quite yet knowing just how hard it was to do what they would do and appreciate the level they were winning at. But I can remember just telling my dad, like, this doesn't matter. Like when they beat Michigan State in the ACC Big Ten Challenge by 35, doesn't matter. When they beat Notre Dame for the Maui tournament final, doesn't matter. When they swept Duke in the regular season, doesn't matter. Because it all just came down to what they did in March. And it was going to be determined by, do they get to the Final Four? Do they win a national championship? So I don't even want to think about what happens if they don't win it, because to this day, I don't appreciate that championship as much as I should. And I was a young fan then. Like as I get older, I should probably not appreciate the titles and the Final Fours as much as I should. But it's kind of the inverse, man, where that's, those 16, that 16 run and that 17 run, I cherish to this day. I hold those memories and those moments experiencing those runs to my heart a lot closer than I did in 2009. 2022 is still something that I get goosebumps just talking about experiencing that, because it literally came out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. Like with 2009, it was an expectation where it was like, you better win the national championship. So I don't even want to talk about a world where they don't get the job done, because I can only imagine the things I'd be saying.
Yeah, well, it wasn't the least enjoyable title. It was the least enjoyable title run. Because when they win the title, it was very enjoyable. You were saying to yourself, this is great, man. We just kicked Tom Izzo's ass. We killed this team, and we did exactly what we were supposed to do, and we got the redemption that we really needed. For 16 and 17, the thing about that run was it wasn't expected, because you had lost Bryce Johnson. You had lost Marcus Page. So that was more fun, because it was like, without those guys, is Carolina really built to win a national championship? And then as we're going along throughout the season, and especially once you got into the NCAA tournament, you started to realize, oh yeah, this team is built for it. The thing about, 2016, what made that more enjoyable is what we're going to talk about when we go through the 2010s with the what ifs, which is 2012. With that moment really makes you enjoy runs a little bit more, because even those runs that we think were guaranteed, they weren't guaranteed, because it can always end because of an injury. And so I think that was part of the reason why we enjoyed 16 so much more. Also, it was two just very enjoyable players. Marcus Page and Bryce Johnson are two of the most enjoyable players. The guy that I still hurt for the most that did not win a national title during my time watching this team is Bryce Johnson. And you may say, how's that? How is it not Marcus Page? I don't know why, man. Just the emotion that Bryce Johnson played with. He was one of the most emotional players that you watched play for Carolina. You could tell that dude absolutely loved being a Tar Heel. And so I wanted a title for him incredibly bad, and it didn't end up working out. But yeah, 17 was amazing. I wouldn't change that for anything, what ends up happening, because that national title was very special. And then, the run in 2022, again, it had been, a little bit of time in between when Carolina last made their run. And so you learn to sort of cherish those runs. The other thing was, it was so unexpected with a group that came out of nowhere. It's a first-year head coach. So that one was one where, honestly, you were just saying, let's enjoy the ride, because we don't know when it's going to end. We thought, okay, it'll probably end in like the Sweet 16 or something like that. Okay, they end up winning. Okay, well, the Elite Eight, they're probably going to be taken out by a team that's a little bit better than them, right? They end up drawing St. Peter's, and you're like, whoa, okay, now we got a chance here. We've got a chance to do something special. You get to the Final Four, and, that's when you think, man, we've got this unbelievable matchup against Duke. We're a team that, is coming in here as the upstarts. All we heard was about how Duke was going to be motivated after what happened, at the end of the regular season. They were going to come in, destroy Carolina, and it would be over, and Carolina's run would end there. And even then, we would have been incredibly heartbroken, but how could you even be disappointed with that under a first-year head coach? And then you go to the national title against Kansas. That team ends up coming up short, and we're still disappointed that they didn't win the title, still disappointed with the people that designed the floor at the Final Four, because if they design a better floor, maybe we end up winning. But, I mean, that run was just it came out of nowhere, and it was so unbelievable under a first-year head coach. Where 2009, it was a mission from the word go. You knew that nothing mattered except winning a national championship, because out of everybody on that team, yes, you wanted it for Lawson, you wanted it for Ellington, you wanted it for Tyler Hansbrough. You wanted it for the most dominant player that we had seen in the ACC, at least since David Thompson, maybe ever. And you said, we need to find a way to cut down the nets for him. And they did. That's why it is such a great memory to look back on. But you're right, man. During that time, and I don't know how older Carolina fans feel. Maybe it was a little bit different for you guys than it was for us as kids. But as kids, we were basically with the mindset going into that year that it was title or bust for this team, and that we weren't going to be satisfied with anything except that national championship win.
Yeah, and maybe this is a poor reflection of me. I didn't celebrate in the moment when they won the national title. Like, I just sat there. Like, there was such an intent level of focusness, which I don't even know if that's a word.
No, the intense level of focus would have been perfectly fine.
I did not celebrate when it was over and the stuff's coming down and you see them hugging and the mob piling. I just sat there because it was just because that was I expected that. Whereas, could you imagine us now? Like, if we, first off, I pray, it is my prayer we get to cover a team that good, that dominant from start to finish. And I hope at some point, man, all the hard work, all the late nights, all that we put into doing this, we get to cover a championship. We've got to cover a championship game in a Final Four run. Yep. We haven't gotten to come back on here and celebrate after the fact. But just how the celebration that I would feel, there was nothing of that. And I've got memorabilia stuff from that championship season. I've got the books and I've got the magazines and all that. So it still means a lot to me, but I didn't celebrate it, man, the way that I tell Ashton now, because I ruined the poor kid at 6 because he doesn't enjoy winning as much as he should enjoy, that's why my thing now whenever we win is I just want to enjoy it because it's so freaking hard. And that team made it look so easy that I didn't enjoy it the way that I should have enjoyed it. And hopefully the next time we get to see a team like that, I enjoy it a lot better, and we get to enjoy it as podcast hosts, as friends, maybe as fathers that have, kids of our own that could sit there and watch the title game. So, I can remember my dad just chastising me, just telling me, you don't know how unique this is. You're watching your team win a national championship. And I'm still complaining that they weren't boxing out, not getting back defensively. And the game was over at the under 16 time out of the first half. And I got up the next morning and rewatched the game. It was critiquing how they could have won by more. That was just how messed up I was. But it also is where the competitive drive is, and where I guess the psycho in me is kind of was born then, and it's still here today. And we'll be experiencing my psycho very soon when we get into the season, and this team either makes me happy or makes me lose my mind. We'll just have to wait and see. But man, what a fun journey looking back at the 2000s was. They're just a jam-packed decade. A lot of good, some bad, a little bit of ugly. But 3 coaches, 4 Final Fours, 2 national championships, a lot of wins over Duke in between. And it brings us to our final decade, which we'll do later this week, a decade of real trial for Carolina as a institution, for the Carolina basketball family, and I think for even the fans. I do think with some of the ups and downs that the program experienced, I do think it kind of created the kind of where we are today, where this fan base is, where they just expect so much because they're used to getting so much. And we'll tackle that a little bit later in the week. But for now, that is going to wrap up this edition of the podcast. In the meantime, guys, we will direct you guys to the website, HeelToughBlog.com. The preseason basketball content will soon be coming your way. ACC tip-off is right around the corner. We'll be rolling out position previews, preseason award watch list, all that, and, of course, the Luka Bogovac news once he is officially cleared. It is Clemson week, though, for Carolina football. That'll be the main focus this week. Anthony will have you cover the preview of the game, the recap of the game. It's a conference game. There will be an injury report that will go up about the game as well. So make sure you check us out every single day, HeelToughBlog.com, the latest and best coverage of Carolina basketball and Tar Heel football. As for the podcast, you guys know where to find us. Every major podcasting platform, simply search the Four Corners Podcast and we'll pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any audio editions of the show throughout the remainder of the offseason / preseason and then on into the regular season. If you are a visual consumer of the podcast, the best way to get notified when we go live, and we have now moved to the video platform, every edition of the podcast that we do, maybe except for interviews where our guys cannot do a visual or video concept, we are on video. The best way to check us out is to like and follow us on Facebook at Heel Tough Blog, like and follow the YouTube channel at Heel Tough Blog. You just hit the notification button, and every time we go live, it'll tell you. Or follow me on Twitter. That's where we stream at HTB_Josh. But with that, folks, it is going to wrap up this edition of the podcast. I do want to thank Anthony once again for hosting with me. We want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.